All right, so after the stages of death and loss with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, we're moving into the different nature of death. So how we can choose, I guess, if you will, the type of death that we want to experience. So the first one is DNRs, which are do not resuscitate. So that means if your heart stops beating, or no brain waves, obviously, you do not want any medical intervention to help bring back life, okay? So a lot of times it means no extreme measures, things like that. It's a very difficult decision to make. Some people, do not want their family members to live with the consequences if for some reason they're unable to be successfully resuscitated, because sometimes brain damage can occur because of lack of oxygen, things like that. Some medical professionals are resistant to following a DNR order. Others are totally accepted to it. But a lot of time, if a medical professional knows that you have a DNR, which is just a state of paper, that is a legal document that says if you were to quit breathing or if your heart rate were to stop, you do not want any life-saving measures to keep you alive. Usually family members also will go by it as well. But again, there's been legal cases where family members still, because they don't want to let go, will still try to keep one alive. Living wills is another document. It's a legal document that pretty much goes by case situation of what you do want medical intervention versus what you don't want. And it also allows you to pick one person legally that can make medical decisions for you. So it's a great thing to have, especially for older adults. They talk to somebody who is willing to make that difficult choice and to sign papers saying that you do not want to continue with medical treatment if does entail extreme measures of resuscitation, saving your life, things like that. They have to be shared with medical personnel. They have to be legal documents. It's just not a verbal thing. So there has to be legal proof. So a touchy subject, another one that your book talks about, is euthanasia and assisted suicide. Assisted suicide is when a medical person or somebody else kind of provides the means for somebody who is terminally ill, somebody that will probably die of their own accord, their own health situation within a few days to weeks to months. And they help the person pretty much commit suicide. It's kind of dying on your own terms. Some states it's legal, some states it's not. Some people are choosing to move to states where it is legal because they don't want their family members to suffer both physically, emotionally, monetarily with caring for somebody who inevitably will die. Dr. Jack Kevorkian, he was sent to prison for this well-known case back in the 80s or 90s, actually 90s, I believe. I can remember listening to those court cases as a teenager and thinking, oh my gosh, But now as an adult, I kind of understand where people may want to die by their own decision, Euthanasia is assisting terminally ill people to die more quickly. You have passive euthanasia is where you remove respirators and they eventually die on their own. And then voluntary active euthanasia, this is where caregivers act to end life before death would normally occur. So if you're terminally ill and the doctors give you 6 months and there's no quality of life, some people will choose other people to kind of help them end their life before they finally die. So it's very highly controversial. Some cultures it's more accepted than others. There's a lot of moral issues with this. You know, a lot of people say nobody should have that right to make that decision. Death is a natural process, things like that. And so states and countries that are more accepting have what they call right to die with dignity laws. So kind of as one is dying, the easing of the death process, a lot of people, about 50% of people, will die in hospitals. Home care is where people choose to go home to stay and then receive continuing medical care and comfort, and they will eventually die in their homes. So a lot of people, if they can afford it and their insurances will cover for it, they want to die in comfort and familiar surroundings, being surrounded by their friends and family. Hospice care, a lot of it's a step down process from hospitals. So it's a place for only terminally ill patients. The focus is not on the cure, but comfort, quality of life. So they may get, high doses of morphine if they're in severe pain so that they're not living through that pain. They allow people to come in and see them more frequently, things like that. It's, a very beautiful, peaceful type of transition. But again, hospice care really depends on insurance and economic resources. There's a few hospice places in Clay County. I know there's one up there. It's a beautiful campus by Academy, and there's some other places as well. Because some people may not want to choose to die at home. They don't want their family members to think, oh, this is where grandma died, or, that type of thing. So, and then how death affects the survivors, going into our last bit of information for this chapter. Funerals are highly expensive. The average funeral cost is around $7,000. For cremation, it can be anywhere from about $5,000. So a lot of people will have insurance money built in for funeral costs. And of course, young people, if they die, that's a concern because not a lot of parents have insurance that covers, mourning as far as funerals go and burial plots, things like that for young kids and teenagers. There's a lot of different Western funeral rituals, prepare the body, religious rituals, things like that. A wake where you go and pay your respects to the person before the funeral happens. A Shiva is a Jewish tradition. This is where people will go for 7 days to sit and pay their respects to that person dying. And then, of course, military funerals involving firing weapons and dragging the flag across the coffin. If you've ever been to a military funeral for somebody who served in the military, it doesn't matter how long they've served in the military, just them serving allows them to get this particular ceremony. It's very, very emotional. I had a student that had already graduated high school a few years ago that served in the Marine Corps, and he was tragically killed, not service related, and of course his parents had a military ceremony, and and I've had family members who've had military ceremonies, and it's the most beautiful thing, but yet emotional at the same time, if you've ever experienced those. And of course, funerals differ from culture to culture. Some cultures, mourners will have to shave their heads as a sign of grief. I know in some Japanese cultures, if you cry at a funeral, it signifies the prevention of that person who has died from being able to cross over to the next life. So crying in some cultures is looked down upon. So emotional displays differ as well. So all funerals kind of mark the end point of life. There are, things that can help the survivors share their grief, share their good memories of the person who has died as well. Cremation has risen dramatically. So about 25% in the 1990s were cremated. Today, about 50%. Some people say they just don't want to be buried in the ground. They rather their ashes be spread, somewhere that they would like, things like that. Some people move around pretty frequently, so they don't want one family member stuck, in California, and they end up finally settling, in Florida, things like that. Bereavement, it's a time of emotional response to the loss. Again, we've talked about the stages of grief, but bereavement really depends on the individual and the situation of the death. So bereavement is the acknowledgement of experiencing death. Grief is our emotional response. Typically for older adults that we know have gone through cancer, things like that, the grief process, emotional response may not be that extreme because we have anticipated that. Versus if it's a young child or a teenager or somebody that was perfectly healthy that dies suddenly, our grief is more severe. Think about all this COVID-19 losses of people who are that have been typically healthy and that have died. This grief process is a whole lot more intense compared to other deaths right now. And of course, not everybody experiences the same situation, the same stages of grief. Everybody experiences it differently. Some people use humor to get through it. Other people, maybe drink celebration-wise, learn a new skill set, go back to work quickly because they don't want to think about living life with the person that they have lost, especially if they've been married for a long time. So, and some people are just more resilient. Some of us have that resilient factor where we don't hold on to stressful and anxious feelings, and we're able to grieve and move on and continue with our life. So, and then there's, of course, definitely unhealthy grief from normal grief. Unhealthy grief is where we allow the grief to consume us. We can't go back to our normal day of life, whereas normal grief process, we may take a week off to grieve, and then we slowly get back to our normal day-to-day processes and, get on with our life. But again, grief is different for everybody else. So men are at greater risk for having consequences with grief, drinking, drugs, alcohol, that type of thing. But again, we can have grief with everything. It's just not physical death, divorce, loss of a job, things like that. But again, here we're mostly talking about the physical death. And of course, how to help people when they cope with grief, kind of be honest, encourage the expression of grief, don't hide it. Of course, if you're talking about children and working with children, make sure they know that they are not to blame for the death in any shape or form. Children's grief, and just like older adults, their grief may not show right away. They may act out in different ways, and the grief process may take a little bit longer for them to show signs of grief versus right when the situation occurs. And of course, children might respond to books that young people have about death and dying as well, to kind of show them that it occurs in other situations, and so they can kind of compare and see that, oh, so-and-so in this story experienced grief this way. Okay, I'm kind of in a similar situation. I'm experiencing my grief this way, and it's healthy and it's normal. Nobody should ever be shamed for expressing their grief. So these are just some different coping mechanisms that are the best to help people, especially children, cope with grief in different ways. And that is chapter 10. So as always, please let me know if you have any questions with the content of this lecture or whatever is in your textbook.